I was seated at the Christmas dinner table, watching my wife slide divorce papers across the wooden tabletop, while her parents literally stood up and started clapping like I'd just been voted off a reality show. Her mom actually said "finally" with this big smile on her face, and her dad patted my soon-to-be ex-wife on the shoulder like she'd just won Employee of the Month. My wife had this cocky smile on her face, this satisfied little grin that said she'd been planning this moment for months, waiting for the perfect time to humiliate me in front of everyone who was important. But then I slid my gift across the table, a small wrapped box that I prepared with great care, and told her to open it before she got too excited about her little performance. She rolled her eyes, still smirking, still confident, and tore off the wrapping paper with these big, showy moves like she was doing me a favor. The moment she opened that box and saw what was inside, her face went from smug satisfaction to absolute horror in about 2 seconds flat. The color left her cheeks, her hands started shaking, and suddenly nobody was clapping anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because this story really starts about 8 months earlier when I first noticed something was off. We'd been married for 7 years at that point, together for 9 total, and I truly thought we were solid. We met back in college at some awful house party where she was the only person actually reading a book in the corner instead of doing keg stands, and I was immediately hooked on how different she seemed from everyone else there. She was getting her MBA while I was building my construction consulting business from scratch, working 18-hour days and sleeping in my truck between job sites half the time. Her family never approved of me because I didn't come from money and I worked with my hands, but she always defended me back then, always told them that I was going to be successful, that I was ambitious and hardworking and everything they should want for their daughter. Her dad owned some finance company downtown and treated me like I was the servant every single time I came over for dinner, but I put up with it because I loved her and I thought she had my back. Things were actually pretty great for the first 6 years. My business started doing well around year 3. We bought a nice apartment in a good neighborhood, took vacations to places her parents had to admit were impressive, and I thought we were building something real together. Then, about 8 months before that Christmas dinner, little things started changing in ways that made my stomach hurt, but that I couldn't quite figure out. First, it was her phone, which had never had a password in all the years we'd been together, suddenly getting locked down with a 6-digit code she wouldn't tell me. When I asked about it, she got defensive immediately and said something about how I was being paranoid and controlling, how she deserved privacy, how married people don't have to share everything. I backed off because I didn't want to be that husband, the suspicious, jealous type who checks phones and acts like a prison warden, but it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then came the girls' nights that started happening every single weekend without fail. She'd been going out with friends once or twice a month for years, and I never thought anything of it. But suddenly, it was every Friday and Saturday night, sometimes not coming home until 3 or 4 in the morning. She'd say she was staying at her friend Alex's place because she'd had too much to drink and didn't want to drive, which seemed responsible enough on the surface. But then I'd smell her hair when she came home, and there was no alcohol smell, no bar smoke smell, nothing except expensive hotel soap and shampoo that definitely wasn't from Alex's apartment. When I mentioned this out, she got angry and told me I was being ridiculous, that I was inventing problems where none existed. And then she'd flip it around and say, "You trust me, don't you?" in this voice that made me feel like a bad husband for even questioning her. The financial stuff started showing up on our joint credit card around the same time. Hotels downtown started appearing on the statement. Nice ones, too. The kind that cost $200 a night minimum. Fancy restaurants I'd never been to with her. Expensive wine bars. Room service charges at 11 at night. When I asked her about these charges, she had explanations ready immediately, almost like she'd been rehearsing them. The hotels were for work conferences she'd forgotten to mention. The restaurants were client dinners that her company was going to reimburse. The wine bars were where the girls' nights happened, because Alex supposedly loved that particular place. Every single explanation was technically possible, technically reasonable, but all of them together started feeling like a wall of lies stacked so high I couldn't see over it anymore. Our relationship at home started getting worse fast around month 5 of all this weirdness. We went from having conversations every night to barely speaking except to plan schedules and argue about whose turn it was to take out the trash.
Intimacy completely disappeared. Stick with this story to the very end to understand the full, shocking truth of this dark relationship psychology. The most valuable insights come later. Remember to subscribe, like, and share this video.
And when I attempted to discuss it, she'd say she was under pressure from work, worn out from her social life, drained from dealing with my constant suspicion and pessimism. Everything became my fault in some way. Every problem we had was because I wasn't supportive enough, wasn't giving her room, wasn't trusting her like a good husband should. The gaslighting got so bad that I started questioning my own mind, wondering if maybe I really was just paranoid and making up drama where none existed. But then I saw something that made all the pieces fit together in the worst possible way. Her sister's husband, Jordan, started acting very strange around me at family gatherings, avoiding eye contact and leaving rooms when I came into them. Jordan worked in corporate real estate and had always been friendly with me before, asking about my business and actually treating me like a human being. Different from the rest of her family. Now he could barely look at me, and when he did, there was this guilty look on his face that made my blood run cold. I started considering timelines and realized that my wife's strange behavior had started right around the time Jordan and her sister had moved back to town after living in Boston for 3 years. I didn't want to believe what I was thinking because it was too awful, too cliché, too much like something from a poor TV movie. But I couldn't stop considering it, couldn't stop putting together all the little details that suddenly made terrible sense when seeing through this new perspective. So I did something I'd never done before in 7 years of being married. I called my buddy Sly, who runs a private investigation company, and asked him to follow my wife for a weekend just to see where she really went during these girls' nights that were happening with such doubtful regularity. Sly owed me a favor from when I'd helped him renovate his office building for almost no money, so he agreed to do it without making noise and without asking too many questions. That first weekend of watching changed everything. Sly sent me photos on Sunday morning that made me feel like someone had hit a hole through my chest and torn my heart out with their bare hands. My wife's car was left at a Marriott downtown Friday night and didn't leave until Saturday afternoon. Jordan's car was parked 3 spots away. Sly had photos of them entering the hotel together at 9 p.m., holding hands and laughing like they were on a honeymoon. He had photos of them leaving together the next morning, her wearing the same clothes from the night before, him with his arm around her middle. There were more photos from Saturday night showing them at an expensive Italian restaurant I'd always wanted to take her to, but she'd said was too pricey. And then more photos of them going back to the same hotel for another time. I sat in my truck in the Home Depot parking lot looking at these photos for probably an hour, feeling like my entire life had just been shown as a lie. This wasn't a single mistake or a drunken hookup she'd regret. This was organized, planned, ongoing. This was my wife of 7 years having a full-blown affair with her own sister's husband, cheating not just me, but her entire family in the most destructive way possible. And from how comfortable they looked together in these photos, how natural and easy their body language seemed, this had been going on for months at least. I told Sly to keep following them because I needed to know exactly how far this went. And over the next month, the evidence built up like a prosecutor's dream case. Every single weekend, without fail, same model, same hotels, same routine. But then Sly found something even worse while looking into Jordan's finances for me. It came out that Jordan had been using his corporate credit card to pay for a lot of these hotels and dinners, basically embezzling from his company to fund his affair with my wife. That's $12,000 over 8 months, all written down, all traceable, all completely illegal. This fool had created a paper trail of his own crimes while destroying 2 marriages at the same time. The final piece fell into place when Sly managed to get into my wife's Gmail account through some technical method he wouldn't explain to me in detail. Those emails were like reading a story for the worst movie ever made, full of personal details I never wanted to know and future plans that made me physically sick. They'd been talking about leaving their spouses for months, making detailed plans about how to start their new life together, discussing when would be the best time to tell everyone. And then I found the email that made me realize this Christmas dinner ambush was fully planned in advance.
They decided the perfect moment to announce everything would be at the family Christmas gathering, where they could tell everyone at once and show themselves as this brave couple who'd found true love despite the messy circumstances. My wife wanted to serve me divorce papers in front of her family so they could all see my humiliation and support her decision, make me look like the bad guy who in some way deserved this treatment. She wanted her moment of victory, her big dramatic scene where she got to be the hero of her own story, while I played the discarded loser husband who wasn't good enough for their family. Anyway, what she didn't know was that I'd spent the last month preparing my own surprise, working with lawyers and accountants and investigators to build a case so airtight that nobody could escape the consequences. I transferred our apartment into a trust with some very detailed legal work, moved assets around in ways that were completely legal but that protected everything I'd built. I'd created separate folders of evidence for every person who needed to see it, including her sister, her parents, Jordan's boss, and eventually the police. I'd even moved her things to a storage unit the week before Christmas and had a locksmith scheduled to change the locks that morning while we were at her parents' house. I was going to let her have her Christmas dinner ambush, let her feel like she'd won for exactly as long as it took her to open my present. So that's how I ended up sitting at that table, watching her face change from smug victory to absolute terror, knowing that everything she'd planned was about to explode in the worst possible way.
The box I gave my wife held something simple, but devastating. A USB drive and a small pile of printed photos showing her and Jordan in various hotels over the past 2 months, along with a note that just said, "Open the drive on your laptop. Everyone deserves to see what you've been doing." She tried to push everything back in the box fast, but her hands were shaking too badly, and some of the photos fell onto the table where her sister could see them. Her sister Sonia picked up one of the photos, showing Jordan and my wife kissing outside a Hilton entrance, and the sound that came out of Sonia's mouth was something between a scream and a gasp that made everyone at the table stop instantly. My wife's parents looked lost at first. Then her dad grabbed the USB drive from the box and said, "What the hell is this?" in this powerful voice he usually kept for firing employees at his finance company. I stood up slowly and told everyone that before we discussed divorce, maybe they should all know exactly why their daughter wanted to end our marriage so much. My wife started saying, "Don't you dare," but her voice broke halfway through, and suddenly she didn't sound confident anymore, just desperate and scared. I explained very calmly that for the past 8 months, she'd been having an affair with Jordan, that they'd been using our joint credit card to fund their hotel weekends, and that Jordan had also been embezzling from his company to pay for extra expenses that our card couldn't cover. Sonia stood up so fast her chair fell backwards, and she started screaming at Jordan, asking if this was true, calling him every name I'd been thinking for the past month, but I'd been too numb to say out loud. Jordan tried to deny it at first, but his face was bright red and he couldn't make eye contact with anyone, just kept stuttering about how it wasn't what it looked like and how he could explain everything. My wife's mom took the USB drive from her husband and said she wanted to see proof because this was too crazy to believe without evidence. I told her to go ahead and plug it into any computer she wanted, that everything was sorted into folders labeled by date and location, complete with hotel receipts, credit card statements, and email exchanges between my wife and Jordan planning their entire future together. My father-in-law actually did plug it into his laptop right there at the table, and I watched his face change as he looked through folders containing months of documented evidence that his daughter had been methodically destroying 2 marriages while stealing money to fund her affair. He kept saying, "Jesus Christ," over and over under his breath, getting quieter each time, like he was losing air. The emails were probably the worst part for everyone to read because they weren't just about plans and meeting times. They were full of intimate details and future plans that made it clear this wasn't some short fling. My wife and Jordan had been discussing leaving their spouses since month 3 of their affair, talking about getting an apartment together downtown, planning trips to Europe they wanted to take once they were free, even joking about how happy they'd be to escape their boring marriages.
There was one email where my wife called me a project that never quite worked out and said she'd only stayed with me as long as she did because I'd finally started making good money and her parents had stopped pushing her to leave. Reading that email had felt like being stabbed when Sly first showed it to me, but watching her parents read it now while sitting 3 feet away from her felt like justice. Her mother started crying and asking how she could do this to her sister, to her family, to herself, and my wife just sat there with her head in her hands, not saying anything. Jordan tried to leave at one point, but Sonia blocked the door and told him if he walked out, she'd call the police herself and report the embezzlement, which was actually my plan anyway, but I was thankful for her initiative. My father-in-law closed his laptop and asked me how long I'd known, and I told him about the month of investigation, the private detective, the financial audits, all of it. He looked at me with something I'd never seen from him before, something that might have been respect, and said he was sorry that his daughter had put me through this horror. But I wasn't done yet, because the divorce papers she'd served me were only one part of her plan, and I wanted everyone to understand the full size of what she'd been attempting to do. I pulled out my own folder from my jacket and explained that over the past month, I'd been working with lawyers to protect everything I'd built, that our apartment was now in a trust she couldn't touch, that our joint accounts had been legally separated with her signature on documents she'd signed without reading carefully, that my business was now under an LLC structure that kept her completely out. Every single asset I'd worked for was protected, and the best part was that she'd helped me do it by signing papers I told her were normal business documents that needed spousal signature. Her face went even whiter when I explained this, and her dad actually laughed this short, bitter laugh and said, "You outplayed him completely." Then I told them about Jordan's embezzlement, showed them the evidence Sly had compiled, showing $12,000 in corporate funds used for personal expenses over 8 months, all documented with receipts and credit card statements. I explained that I'd already sent this information to Jordan's boss and to the company's legal department, and that there would likely be criminal charges filed within the next week. Jordan started crying at this point, actual tears running down his face, saying he'd pay it all back and begging me not to ruin his life over a mistake. I looked at him and said, "You destroyed your own life the first time you took my wife to a hotel on your company's dime." Sonia announced right there that she was filing for divorce and taking their daughter to stay with her parents until she found her own place. And my mother-in-law immediately said that wouldn't be possible because they're not backing this mess. The whole family dynamic I'd watched for 9 years just broke in about 15 minutes, everyone turning on each other, blame flying in every direction. My wife sobbing and trying to explain that they'd fallen in love and couldn't help themselves. Her dad shut that down immediately and said you could have helped yourself by getting divorced before you started sleeping with your sister's husband, in this icy voice I'd never heard him use with his daughters before. I grabbed my coat and told everyone I was leaving, that my lawyer would be in touch with my wife about the divorce proceedings, and that I'd be filing a countersuit for adultery and financial damages that would make her initial paperwork look like a joke.
My wife tried to stop me as I walked toward the door, holding my arm and saying we needed to talk in private, that I didn't understand the entire situation. I pulled my arm away and told her, "I understand that you wanted to humiliate me in front of your family today, but instead you humiliated yourself in front of everyone who matters, and that's something you're going to have to live with forever." Her mom was still crying. Her dad was shouting at Jordan about betraying their family's trust. Sonia was on the phone, likely calling a divorce lawyer, and my wife just stood there in the middle of all this chaos she'd created, looking small and lost. I walked out to my truck and sat there for a minute, watching through the window as the family continued falling apart without me. My phone started ringing with texts from my wife pleading with me to come back inside and talk, saying she'd made a mistake, saying we could fix this. I blocked her number right there and drove to my apartment. Except it wasn't our apartment anymore. It was legally mine in every way that counted. When she finally tried to come home later that night, all her keys didn't work and all her belongings were waiting for her in a climate-controlled storage unit I'd paid for through the end of the month.
The thing about revenge is that it only feels good if you've really planned it through, if you've covered every part and protected yourself from the aftermath. I'd used a month preparing for this exact moment, working with 3 different lawyers to make sure everything I did was completely legal, transferring assets in ways that couldn't be fought in court, putting together evidence files that would stay solid under any scrutiny. My wife had spent 8 months thinking she was so clever, planning her big Christmas announcement, probably dreaming about how free she'd feel once she finally escaped our marriage. What she didn't understand was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time, and now she was standing in the ruins of her own life with nobody left to blame but herself. The best part was knowing that this was just the beginning, that the legal proceedings and criminal charges and social fallout were all still coming, and that every single result was something she'd gained through her own choices. The divorce proceedings started in early January, about 2 weeks after Christmas, and turned into exactly the nightmare my wife had been trying to avoid by ambushing me first. My lawyer filed a countersuit citing adultery with documented evidence, financial infidelity, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, which it turns out is a real legal thing you can sue for in our state. Her lawyer tried to argue for a standard 50-50 split of assets, but my attorney just kept piling evidence folders on the table during mediation until her side eventually gave up trying to claim she deserved anything. The judge took one look at the timeline of her affair, the financial records showing how she'd spent our money on hotels with another man, and the emails discussing how to control the divorce announcement for maximum impact, and decided that equitable distribution wasn't going to apply in this case. The divorce was finalized 6 months later in July, and I kept the apartment, the car, my business, and our joint savings, while she walked away with her personal belongings and about $15,000 in credit card debt she'd built up during those 8 months of affair expenses. Jordan's situation got even worse somehow, which I didn't think was possible, but corporate America doesn't play with embezzlement. His company fired him 3 days after I sent them the evidence, then immediately filed criminal charges for theft of corporate funds and fraud. The investigation grew once the company's forensic accountants got involved, and they found he'd actually stolen closer to $18,000, not the $12,000 we documented. He tried to pay it all back immediately by cashing out his retirement accounts and taking loans from family members, but the company prosecuted anyway because they wanted to make an example out of him. He ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial and got sentenced to 14 months in county jail, plus 5 years probation and full restitution, including interest and the company's legal fees. Sonia divorced him while he was awaiting sentencing and got primary custody of their daughter, plus child support that would start the moment he got out of jail, if he could find any job willing to hire a convicted embezzler. My wife's life fell apart in steps that were almost like a poem to watch from a distance. First, she lost her job at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 6 years, not because they fired her officially, but because the scandal made her toxic and they persuaded her to resign before clients started requesting different account managers. Then she lost her friend group because it seems nobody wants to stay close with someone who had an affair with her own brother-in-law and destroyed 2 families simultaneously. Her social media went from constant posts about brunches and girls' trips to completely silent because every photo she'd posted for the past year was basically evidence of lies she'd been telling. She moved back to her childhood bedroom at her parents' house because she couldn't pay for rent anywhere decent on unemployment benefits, and her parents made it clear she wasn't allowed to stay long-term. The financial destruction was probably the most satisfying part for me, because money was always how her family judged success and worth. She'd spent years looking down on my working-class background, enjoying the lifestyle my business provided, and now she was penniless in a way her family found absolutely shameful. Her parents had to take out a loan to pay for her divorce attorney because she'd used up her savings on hotel expenses and had nothing left for legal defense. They made her pay them back by working at her dad's company doing data entry for $13 an hour, which was clearly the only job he could give her without his other employees quitting in protest.
Her sister wouldn't speak to her at all, wouldn't let her see her niece, blocked her on every app, and told everyone at their mom's book club exactly what happened, so the whole social group knew the details. My business actually expanded during this period because it seems people love supporting a small business owner who got publicly betrayed and handled it with class. The story got around through my network of contractors and clients, always told as this guy's wife cheated on him with her sister's husband and he completely outmaneuvered her, legally. I got new business from people who'd never used my services before, but who wanted to support me. Got invited to networking events by guys who respected how I handled the situation, even got written about in a local business magazine article about entrepreneurs who'd overcome personal adversity. Everything she tried to take from me ended up making me stronger, while everything she tried to build for herself fell into nothing. The lessons in dark relationship psychology here are powerful. Watch until the end for the final, crucial revelations. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video.
About 4 months after the divorce was finalized in November, I saw her at Home Depot while I was picking up materials for a renovation project. She looked awful in ways that went beyond just not wearing makeup or having her hair done. She looked beaten and worn out, like someone who'd been running on empty for months. She tried to come up to me in the parking lot, and I immediately told her we had nothing to discuss, that our lawyers could communicate if there were any legal issues left. She started crying right there between the cars and said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd thrown away something real for something that was never going to work, that she understood now what she'd lost. I just looked at her and said, "You didn't lose anything. You purposely destroyed it because you thought you'd found something better, and now you get to live with that choice forever." She asked if there was any chance we could talk, maybe get coffee, maybe work toward forgiveness, even if we couldn't work toward getting back together. I told her I'd forgiven her months ago, because keeping anger was just hurting myself. But that forgiveness didn't mean I wanted her in my life in any way. She kept saying she'd changed, that she'd learned from this experience, that she was going to therapy and working on herself. I believed her, probably, but I also didn't care, because her personal growth journey wasn't my job anymore. I told her, "I spent 7 years loving someone who turned out to be a character you were playing, and I'm not interested in meeting whoever you actually are underneath that act." Then I got in my truck and drove away while she stood there crying in the parking lot. The last I heard through shared acquaintances was that she'd moved to a different city about 2 hours away to escape the social fallout and start over somewhere nobody knew her story. She got a job doing customer service for an insurance company making about $40,000 a year, which was half what she'd been making before and a quarter of what our combined household income had been. She was dating someone new, it seems, some guy she'd met through a dating app who didn't know about her past. And I truly hoped it worked out for her, because I wasn't the kind of person who wanted her to suffer forever. I just wanted her to suffer enough to understand what she'd done, to really feel the consequences of betraying everyone who trusted her. Jordan got out of jail after 11 months on good behavior and moved in with his parents because Sonia had sold their house and taken her half of the money. He was working at a warehouse doing inventory management for $15 an hour because his felony conviction made it impossible to get hired in corporate real estate again. He was paying child support and restitution and still owed his parents money for the first payback to his company. So in short, his entire paycheck disappeared before he saw any of it. Sonia had remarried about 18 months after their divorce to a guy from her gym who seemingly treated her daughter like his own and actually came to family events. And I was truly happy for her because she'd been an innocent victim in all this, just like me. My wife's parents never apologized to me directly, but her dad did send me a formal letter about 6 months after everything imploded, saying he'd been wrong about my character and that I'd handled an impossible situation with more grace and intelligence than he'd given me credit for. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to keep a relationship, just admitted that he'd been wrong about me and that his daughter had destroyed something valuable through her own selfishness. I valued the letter, even though it didn't change anything, because having that confirmation from someone who'd looked down on me for years felt like finishing a circle. The whole experience taught me that revenge doesn't have to be loud or dramatic to be effective. It just has to be thorough and legal and perfectly timed. My wife had wanted her big dramatic moment at Christmas dinner where she got to be the hero of her own story, and I had let her have exactly that moment, right up until I'd turned it into her worst nightmare. She wanted to humiliate me in front of her family,
And instead, she'd humiliated herself so completely that years later, people still talked about it as a warning tale. She'd wanted to start fresh with Jordan, and instead she'd ended up alone and broke and socially destroyed while he sat in jail paying for both their mistakes. I moved on, eventually started dating again, met someone who actually valued what I'd built and who didn't see my background as something to overcome. My business kept growing, my apartment went up in value, my life got better in ways I couldn't have pictured while I was sitting in that Home Depot parking lot, looking at evidence photos and feeling like my world had ended. Sometimes I still thought about that Christmas dinner and how perfectly everything had gone according to my plan, how her face had looked when she opened that box and realized she'd been outmaneuvered completely. Those thoughts didn't make me angry anymore. They just made me thankful that I'd had the wisdom to protect myself and the patience to let her destroy herself. She'd wanted to end our marriage on her terms, but in the end, she'd ended it on mine, and that made all the difference. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments. Drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories. This concludes the story, but the insights into dark relationship psychology are vital. Understanding the full cycle is key. Please subscribe to Reddit Stories Rewind, like, and share this video.